So you're in your local nutrition shop and, you're going to get more pre-workout and creatine and protein powder. I know if you're like me, you wait to the last minute to get all this stuff. And you're walking down the aisles, and on one of the shelves you see CBD balm, proven to improve muscle recovery and get rid of pain. And you ask yourself, well, I've heard of CBD before, but does it actually improve muscle recovery? Because if it does, I definitely want to try that. Well, let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to the Science Behind That podcast. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton, and as you heard from the intro, in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the science behind CBD and its effect on post-workout muscle recovery. And this is kind of an interesting topic because personally I use CBD, and especially on big heavy leg days, where I break personal records. I find anyway that a quality CBD balm definitely helps at least the soreness go away. But does it actually help or have any impact at all on muscle cell anabolism? Or does it induce catabolism? So we're going to be talking about that today. We're also going to be briefly talking about how CBD reduces pain. So before we get started, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite all of you to go grab yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and we will jump right in. So CBD and muscle recovery. This is an interesting topic. It's an emerging subject of research, and from an application perspective, it's the use of CBD to treat both chronic pain and post-muscle soreness has been growing worldwide. Now, part of that is because of anecdotal evidence. My friend Bob said CBD works great. But then the other part of it is the actual applications of CBD by individuals with chronic pain, and the studies that have also linked CBD with being able to reduce chronic pain. But the idea of using CBD oil or CBD balm, CBD tinctures as effective post-workout recovery devices is relatively recent, but it comes from the literature and the anecdotal accounts that state that CBD is very effective at reducing pain. But before we can dive in head first into this subject to actually examine these claims, we have to first understand a few basic things. First, we have to talk about the molecular structure of CBD, what it is, how it's different than its cousin THC. I also want to mention, how CBD is extracted. Somebody in their mom's basement may have a hemp plant, but how do you go from that marijuana plant to purified CBD oil? So we'll talk about that. And then, of course, we'll also touch on the mechanisms of action of muscle repair. And that's going to be really important for later on in the episode, where we address if CBD can be used for muscle recovery. Sorry, I had to take a sip of my coffee there. So let's get into it. So what is CBD? Well, CBD is cannabidiol, and I'm sorry for all of those of you out there who are like, oh my god, that was the worst pronunciation of that ever. Sorry. But CBD is a phytocannabinoid, one of 113 others or so. It's very similar to tetrahydrocannabinol or THC. But the phenol ring and the limonene moiety in CBD is different than the structures that we see in THC, which is it does two things. Number one, it results in CBD not having the psychoactive effects that THC does because it doesn't bind to the same receptors in the brain. And two, it allows CBD to interact with a variety of different cell targets, some of which we don't even know what they are. And certain pathways, for instance, how does CBD from a molecular level reduce pain? We don't really know how that works, but ultimately it's that phenol ring and then that limonene moiety that contribute most heavily to CBD's function. I'm gonna spare all of you all the excruciating details about when CBD was first isolated and all that stuff. And we'll just jump right into how is CBD extracted. Ultimately, there are four primary ways that CBD can be extracted and purified from raw hemp. Supercritical CO2 extraction, solvent extraction, steam distillation, and oil extraction. So we're going to go into each of these one by one. And ethanol extraction, but that's kind of like in the solvent extraction category. So first off, supercritical CO2 extraction. What the hell is this? I know I said a lot of words there. But it's fairly simple. So all that is it's CO2 extraction using very cold and high pressured carbon dioxide to extract the CBD from the plant, right? And this can also be used with THC as well. But when you cool carbon dioxide down and when you put it under high pressure conditions, it creates a liquid. Technically, it reaches what's called a supercritical point. And the supercritical point is where the substance exists both as a liquid and a gas. And once CO2 is in this state, it's actually really effective at extracting CBD from your hemp powder. And supercritical CO2 allows people to control temperature and pressure to extract a specific amount of product of CBD without any concern of having residues left over. So the CO2 will bind to the CBD oil, and it will remove it, extract it from the hemp, and it will leave everything else in the plant. And so this method, as you may imagine, is expensive, but it does result in very high concentrations of CBD, just because of how specifically the CO2 is able to bind to the CBD and remove it from solution. The next method is solvent extraction. Solvent extraction is exactly as it sounds, and it's basically the exact same method behind solvent extraction for caffeine. When you go to the grocery store and you look on the shelf for decaffeinated coffee, for the most part, unless that bag of coffee says decaffeinated using the Swiss water method, the decaffeination process involves using solvents like hexane, and you soak the coffee beans in the hexane. The hexane attaches to the caffeine and removes it from the coffee beans. Of course, then after that, the coffee beans are washed and then roasted. There's still some hexane residue, but it's a very similar principle here, with one big difference. With solvent extraction for CBD, the way that works is you basically take hemp powder, and you mix it with the solvent. For this example, we'll use ethanol. And what happens is the ethanol binds to the CBD in that hemp powder, or that hemp material that you put in there. It'll bind to the CBD and remove it from the hemp. After that process, you then have a solution. You filter out the bits of hemp, obviously, and you're left with a solution of alcohol of ethanol, and or whatever your solvent is, that is chemically bound to your CBD. And then the simple process here is you evaporate off the ethanol and you're left with CBD oil. And it's the similar process for a variety of other solvents you could use. The only problem with this, of course, is that it doesn't matter how precise you are or how good you think you are at this, you will always have uh, some solvent residue. So because of that, it's not the go-to option over CO2, but it is an option that's much cheaper and easier to do. And then, of course, we have steam distillation of hemp oil. And steam distillation is a very, very old processing method, and it's very effective. Basically, you have hemp oil, and you heat it with water in a distiller, and it vaporizes the oil and the water, and then it condenses the oil, and the oil will condense out of solution at a faster rate than the water will, and so then you'll be left with a distillate of whatever your oil is. You can also do this with raw hemp itself. So you can mix raw hemp in a distiller or a distiller with water. You boil it, you heat it up. That removes the CBD, removes the THC, etc., from the hemp, and then they evaporate off at different rates. So then you're able to separate them out. And then, of course, we have extraction using oil. So oil, very similar idea to the ethanol method. Oils that will preferentially bind to CBD are added to hemp through the process of soaking it. And then over time, the cannabinoids dissolve into the oil. And after a while, they've, for the most part, completely dissolved into the oil, at which point the CBD can be separated from the oil using steam distillation or any variety of other methods. So that's how CBD is extracted. So the other thing that we have to talk about before we get into does CBD actually help with muscle recovery is, how do muscles recover? What does that process look like? If I go to the gym, right, like I did this morning, if I go to the gym and I leg press 820 pounds, let's say, what's happening there? What's happening to my gluteals? What's happening to my quads? Well, we've talked about this many times before on this podcast, but ultimately you're creating micro tears in that muscle tissue. And through the process of creating these micro tears, it activates a very special type of cell called a myosatellite cell. And what a myosatellite cell is it's a stem cell. It's a type of multipotent mesenchymal stem cell that differentiates into myoblasts and then eventually myofibrils. And so what happens is if I go to the gym and I leg press 820 pounds, let's say, I've now sustained all these micro tears in my primary and secondary muscles used for that movement, right? Once that happens, signals are released from the damaged muscle tissue, pro-inflammatory cytokines that stimulate the differentiation of the satellite cells into myoblasts and then ultimately myofibers. So I'm sure many of you out there, especially those of you that do any kind of MCAT studying or DAT studying, have heard people say before that muscle cells do not divide, which is accurate. They don't divide. They reproduce through the use of satellite cells. So when you're tearing those muscles, those satellite cells differentiate into brand new myofibrils that link up with the damaged ones. And that linkage with the damaged ones can be done through a variety of different processes. A lot of times keloid tissue or scar tissue is involved, but ultimately that's what happens when you tear muscle. Now, I could get into the difference in types of training between training for muscle size, hypertrophy, and then training for strength, but that's not ultimately relevant here. All that matters is that when you go to the gym and when you work out, those micro tears that you're sustaining activate satellite cells, which then change into adult muscle cells, basically, to repair that muscle tissue. And that is an inflammatory process, right? So you may be sitting there, well, Atticus, why are you emphasizing this inflammatory process? Because oftentimes when we see things that say they help with post-workout soreness, that post-workout soreness is your body's natural inflammation response to stimulate satellite cell differentiation, right? And there's another aspect there, which is you have innervation happening there in the new muscle tissue, and you have the stimulation of new nerves, etc., or new nerve endings. But ultimately, that soreness you're feeling is the process of your body's muscle cells that are damaged, releasing cytokines that are saying, hey, over here, satellite cells, differentiate into new muscle and repair me. So when you have things like ice baths, and I know many of you that have listened to my podcast for a long time know I'm a big advocate of ice baths in most situations, but however, the exception is this situation, right? For a while, it was a really big trend, the ice bucket challenge and cold plunges, etc. And this idea of doing an ice bath right after exercise because it's anti-inflammatory, which it is. But therein lies the problem, right? If you go to the gym and you work out and you're sore, that's good. You're sore afterwards, that's a good thing. But if you then go and take Advil and a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, right? Or you do an ice bath, you're inhibiting the inflammation, which is necessary to stimulate new muscle growth and development. So oftentimes when we see things like people advocating for ice baths immediately following exercise, it's counterproductive because you're actually reducing inflammation, which immediately following weightlifting, you need that inflammation to stimulate muscle cell development. Now, do ice baths have uses after training? Absolutely. Do they have advantageous benefits? Absolutely. But they're not something that you want to do immediately post-workout, because otherwise it's going to reduce the effectiveness of your satellite cell differentiation into myoblasts. Had to take a sip of my coffee there. So then, now that we know that, now we can actually talk about CBD. Ultimately, the question of does CBD actually help with muscle soreness? The answer is potentially, right? There are a lot of anecdotal accounts of people saying that it does. But the actual mechanisms through which that happens are unknown. And of course, we have to be careful here as well. We know CBD is anti-inflammatory, and the mechanisms by which CBD is anti-inflammatory generally revolves around removing free radicals from tissues, which we've talked about them before. They are they are ions basically that are very, very electronegative, electropositive, and they're trying to tear away electrons from anything they can to become neutral in an abridged sense. Those are free radicals. And so antioxidants suppress the activity of free radicals. Free radicals have been shown to be pro-inflammatory in a negative aspect. When we have looked at clinical studies of patients with chronic inflammation, oftentimes it's these free radical species that exacerbate those autoimmune destruction activities and the detrimental effects of constant inflammation. Along with that, we do know that CBD has shown in small studies to reduce the expression of a variety of different cytokines, such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, which are very, very strong cytokines. However, in some of the most recent studies, treatments of CBD on rodents that were that either had muscular dystrophy, were obese, or went through some sort of weightlifting muscle stimulation exercise routine, it was determined that CBD did not actually affect muscle anabolism, which at first sounds bad, but when you read on, it was determined that it improves satellite cell differentiation. So what does this mean? Atticus, what is anabolism? Anabolism is building things, building tissue. Catabolism is breaking them down. When I was in college, in my pathology of human and animal disease class, the way I always remembered that was anabolism sounds like anabolic steroids, which build you bigger, right? Bigger muscles. And catabolism to me always sounded like cannibalism, and for whatever reason, it just stuck. As catabolism is cannibalism, or breaking down complex molecules, and anabolism are anabolics, which build up complex molecules. And in the context of this study, it was determined that CBD did not induce anabolism or building muscle tissue. However, it improved satellite cell differentiation. And so if we're accelerating the rate of satellite cell differentiation, right, then theoretically we are more efficiently able to repair damaged muscle tissue than if there was not that intervention. Additionally, CBD treatment in rodents reduced muscle inflammation following eccentric exercises, which at first sounds like a negative thing, but as long as we're not affecting anabolism in a negative way, that's a good thing, because reduction in inflammation does reduce pain, and that is universal. Doesn't matter if that's good inflammation or bad inflammation, a reduction in inflammation reduces pain. The positive thing here in this study is that it reduces inflammation, does not affect muscle anabolism, and it seems to enhance the differentiation of satellite cells, which correlate, they don't correlate, they do stimulate muscle repair, right? However, of course, this was all done in rodents, and so the transferability, I guess, of the results seen in this paper, it can be called into question when it comes into application in humans. I couldn't find many, if any, studies on humans looking specifically at anabolic effects of CBD. There's plenty of studies that look at pain reduction, right? Because CBD does also, along with reducing free radicals, along with reducing inflammation, CBD does seem to act on certain pain receptors. Now, the mechanisms by which that occurs is still under question, basically. But as far as it goes in the context of how does CBD affect muscle growth, there's very few, if any, studies out there. Well, maybe one or two. And those one or two studies that are out there are the ones I mentioned, talking about rodents. So ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, today we discussed what CBD is, how it's extracted, and we discussed muscle repair and how that works, and then we also mentioned how CBD reduces pain, and then if it is a substance that could be used for enhancing muscle recovery post-workout. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, it seems like there's promising research in that area that it may help with muscle recovery, and it may help stimulate satellite cell differentiation. However, of course, as with many things that we talk about on this podcast, the data just isn't there. There's not a lot of studies out there, and this field of research is still in its infancy. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, I know that many people out there have derived great benefit from CBD and use it very frequently. Again, I use it on days when I'm really, really sore from really heavy lifts. So, ladies and gentlemen, try it if you can. If it's legal in your jurisdiction, try it, experiment with it, and see how it affects your fitness journeys. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Science Behind That podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I will see you all on Friday. And remember, as always, ladies and gentlemen, stand up and question everything.
Catch me if I fall.